The winter wind cut through the Montana territory like a blade, carrying with it whispers of a love story that would challenge everything two worlds believed about beauty, worth, and the courage to see beyond scars that ran deeper than skin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first snowfall of 1847 painted the rolling hills outside Fort Benton white, but inside the cramped settlement, Rebecca May Thornton pressed herself against the rough wooden walls of the supply shed, hoping to become invisible. At 17, she had perfected the art of disappearing, though the raised, twisted scars that covered the left side of her face from temple to jaw made true invisibility impossible. The fire happened when she was 8 years old. A cooking accident in the small cabin she shared with her widowed mother, Sarah, had left Rebecca forever marked. The flames had taken more than her smooth skin. They had stolen her place in a world that measured a woman's value by her beauty and marriageability. Now 9 years later, she moved through Fort Benton like a ghost, completing her chores before dawn and after dusk, always keeping to the shadows. "There's that burned girl again," whispered Martha Henderson, the blacksmith's wife, as Rebecca hurried past with an armload of mended clothes. Poor thing. What man would ever want damaged goods like that? Rebecca's fingers instinctively rose to touch the scars, a habit she couldn't break despite years of her mother's gentle corrections. She quickened her pace toward the modest cabin at the settlement's edge, where Sarah Thornton took in, washing and mending to support them both. The other settlers tolerated their presence, barely because Sarah's skill with needle and thread was unmatched. But Rebecca knew she was seen as nothing more than an unfortunate burden. The cabin sat isolated from the main cluster of buildings, reflecting their status as outsiders. Sarah had chosen this spot deliberately when they'd arrived 3 years ago, fleeing the cruel whispers and pointing fingers of their previous home in Missouri. But even here, in this rough frontier settlement where survival mattered more than social graces, Rebecca found herself an object of pity at best, revulsion at worst. Inside the one-room cabin, Sarah looked up from her sewing as Rebecca entered. At 42, she still carried herself with quiet dignity despite the hardships that had aged her beyond her years. Her husband's death in a riverboat accident had left her with few options, and Rebecca's disfigurement had closed even more doors. "Mrs. Patterson wants her blue dress taken in before Sunday service," Rebecca said, setting down the bundle of clothes. She wouldn't look at me when she gave me the measurements." Sarah's jaw tightened. Eleanor Patterson has always been small-minded. Don't let her make you feel small, too. But Rebecca had long ago stopped believing her mother's reassurances. She had eyes, she had mirrors. She knew what she looked like, and more importantly, she knew how the world saw her. In a society where women were expected to attract husbands and bear children, she was already counted among the lost. That evening, as Rebecca walked to the creek to fetch water, she didn't notice the rider watching from the ridge above the settlement. Charging Bear had been observing Fort Benton for several days, part of a scouting party sent by his Blackfoot band to assess the growing white presence in their territory. At 25, he was considered one of the finest warriors among the Piegan Blackfoot, known for his skill in battle and his wisdom in council. But it wasn't military intelligence that held his attention now. It was the young woman moving gracefully through the twilight, her long brown hair catching the last rays of sunlight. Even from a distance, he could see the careful way she held herself, as if trying to take up as little space as possible in the world. Charging Bear had always possessed an unusual gift, the ability to see beyond surfaces to the spirit beneath. His grandmother, a medicine woman respected throughout their band, had recognized this talent when he was still a boy. "Some people see only with their eyes," she had told him. "You see with your heart. This is both a gift and a burden, grandson." Now, watching this unknown woman, he felt that familiar stirring, the recognition of something beautiful and wounded, that others might overlook. There was something in the way she moved, a grace mixed with guardedness, that spoke to him across the distance and cultural divide. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A small party of Blackfoot warriors had been spotted near the settlement, and Fort Benton's military commander, Captain James Morrison, called for increased vigilance. The relationship between the white settlers and the various native tribes in the region was tense at best, with conflicts over land and resources growing more frequent. Rebecca heard the news while delivering laundry to the captain's wife, Helen Morrison. Unlike many of the other settlement women, Mrs. Morrison had always treated Rebecca with basic courtesy, though she was careful never to be seen speaking with her in public. "Captain Morrison says they're just scouting," Helen confided as she inspected her freshly pressed linens. "But we're not to venture far from the settlement alone. You should be especially careful, dear, walking to the creek by yourself." The warning proved prophetic, though not in the way anyone expected. 3 days later, as Rebecca made her evening trip to fetch water, she encountered a group of young white men from the settlement, led by Thomas Garrett, the son of Fort Benton's most prosperous merchant. They had been drinking and were in the mood for cruel entertainment. "Well, look what we have here," Thomas called out, his words slurred. The scarred girl, all alone. Rebecca tried to step around them, but they formed a loose circle, blocking her path. Her heart began to race, but she kept her eyes down, hoping submissiveness would satisfy them. "Come now, don't be shy," said another young man, Edwin Wells. "We just want to get a better look at that pretty face of yours." The laughter that followed was harsh and mocking. Rebecca clutched her water bucket tighter, knuckling white against the wooden handle. She had endured years of stares and whispers, but this felt different, more threatening. "I heard she scared a baby just by looking at it," Thomas continued, emboldened by his friend's laughter. "Maybe we should see if the stories are true." "Please," Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible. "Let me pass. What was that? Speak up, monster girl." The cruelty in his voice made her flinch, but before the situation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the evening air, speaking in a language none of them understood. "Charging." Bear emerged from the trees near the creek, moving with the silent grace of someone accustomed to traveling unseen. He had been watching the settlement for days, and when he'd seen the young men surround the scarred woman, something in him had awakened, a protective instinct as old as time itself. The white men spun around, hands moving instinctively toward weapons that weren't there. Thomas, despite his earlier bravado, took a step backward when he saw the tall, powerfully built Blackfoot warrior standing 20 feet away. "Stay back, savage," Thomas managed, though his voice cracked with fear. "This is white man's business." "Charging." Bear's dark eyes moved from the young men to Rebecca, taking in her frightened posture and the protective way she held herself. Even in the dim light, he could see the scars on her face, but what struck him most was the dignity she maintained. Despite her obvious fear, he spoke again in Blackfoot, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. Though the white men couldn't understand his words, his meaning was clear: leave. "We should go," whispered Edwin, tugging at Thomas's sleeve. "There might be more of them." Thomas wanted to maintain his masculine pride, but faced with a trained warrior, discretion won out. "This isn't over," he muttered, though it was unclear whether he was addressing Rebecca or charging Bear. As the young men retreated toward the settlement, Rebecca found herself alone with the Blackfoot warrior. She should have been terrified. Everything she'd been taught told her that native warriors were dangerous, unpredictable. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that had been absent from her interactions with white men for years. Respect. Charging Bear stepped closer, moving slowly so as not to frighten her further. In the growing darkness, he could see her scars more clearly now, the way the firelight had permanently marked her skin. But where others saw disfigurement, he saw survival. Where others saw shame, he saw strength. He spoke softly in English. Words learned through years of trading with white trappers and soldiers. "You are safe now." Rebecca stared at him in amazement. Not only was this warrior speaking her language, but his voice held none of the mockery or pity she was accustomed to hearing. There was something else there, something that made her heart beat faster, though not from fear. "Thank you," she managed, her voice still shaky from the confrontation. Charging Bear nodded toward her water bucket, which she had dropped when the men surrounded her. Without being asked, he retrieved it and filled it from the creek, his movements efficient and sure. When he handed it back to her, their fingers brushed briefly, and Rebecca felt an electric shock of connection. "You should not walk alone when the sun sets," he said, his English careful but clear. "There are many dangers." He meant the young white men, but Rebecca heard something deeper in his words, a concern that seemed to encompass more than just her physical safety. For the first time in years, someone was looking at her not as a burden or an object of pity, but as a person worthy of protection. As she walked back toward the settlement, water bucket in hand, Rebecca found herself glancing back repeatedly. The Blackfoot warrior remained by the creek until she was safely out of sight, a silent guardian in the growing darkness. That night, as she lay on her narrow cot listening to her mother's gentle breathing, Rebecca replayed every moment of the encounter. She had been taught to fear native warriors, to see them as threats to civilization and Christian values. But the man by the creek had shown her more kindness in those few minutes than she had received from her own people in months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Meanwhile, in a camp several miles away, Charging Bear sat by his own fire, staring into the flames and thinking about scarred skin and frightened eyes that held depths of strength their owner didn't recognize. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. "True beauty lives in the spirit, grandson. Those who can see it are blessed. Those who cannot are cursed to live in a world of shadows." The meeting by the creek had lasted only minutes, but both Rebecca and Charging Bear sensed that something significant had shifted in their worlds. Neither could have predicted that this brief encounter would set in motion events that would challenge everything their two peoples believed about love, loyalty, and the courage required to see beauty where others saw only scars. The following weeks brought an unusual pattern to Rebecca's life. Each evening, as she made her way to the creek for water, she found herself scanning the tree line with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The Blackfoot warrior had not appeared again, but she couldn't shake the memory of his presence. The way he had looked at her without flinching, without the familiar mixture of pity and revulsion she had grown accustomed to seeing in people's eyes. Fort Benton had grown increasingly tense since the sighting of native scouts. Captain Morrison had doubled the watch and issued strict orders about venturing beyond the settlement's perimeter. The merchants worried about their trade routes, while the families whispered about potential raids and the safety of their children. Rebecca's mother, Sarah, noticed the change in her daughter's demeanor immediately. After 17 years of watching Rebecca shrink from the world, she observed something different, a restlessness, a tendency to gaze toward the distant hills with an expression Sarah couldn't quite interpret. "You seem troubled lately," Sarah mentioned one morning as they sorted through a new batch of mending. "More than usual." Rebecca's hand stilled on the torn fabric she was examining. How could she explain the confusion of emotions swirling within her? How could she tell her mother that a stranger, a Blackfoot warrior no less, had shown her more genuine kindness than any white man ever had? "I've been thinking about our future here," Rebecca said instead, which wasn't entirely untrue. "Whether we'll always be outsiders." Sarah set down her needle and studied her daughter's face. The scars had faded to pale silver lines over the years, but they still dominated the left side of Rebecca's features. Sarah had long ago accepted that her daughter would likely never marry, never have the life most women took for granted. It was a source of quiet grief that she carried like a stone in her chest. We make our own place in this world, Rebecca. It may not be the place others would choose for us, but it's ours." Before Rebecca could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the small window, they could see a crowd gathering near the settlement's main gate. Captain Morrison was addressing a group of mounted soldiers while settlers clustered nearby, their faces etched with concern. Rebecca slipped outside to listen, positioning herself at the edge of the crowd where she was less likely to draw attention. The captain's words made her blood run cold. "A trading post 20 miles south was attacked 3 days ago," Morrison announced. "2 men dead, supplies stolen. We have reason to believe it was the same band of Blackfoot that's been scouting our area." Murmurs of fear and anger rippled through the crowd. Rebecca felt a sick twist in her stomach. Could the warrior who had protected her have been involved in such violence? The possibility seemed to contradict everything she had sensed about him. Yet she knew how little she truly understood about the conflicts raging across the territory. "All women and children are to remain within the settlement boundaries," Morrison continued. "No exceptions. Anyone caught violating this order will face severe consequences." As the crowd dispersed, Rebecca caught fragments of heated conversations. Some called for preemptive strikes against nearby native camps, while others argued for negotiation. The merchant families, led by Thomas Garrett's father, seemed particularly vocal about the need for aggressive action to protect their business interests. That evening, despite the captain's orders, Rebecca found herself drawn to the creek. She told herself she was simply fetching water as usual, but deep down she knew she was hoping for another encounter. The water bucket felt heavy in her hands as she approached the familiar spot, her eyes searching the shadows. He was there, emerging from behind a cluster of cottonwood trees as silently as before. But this time, Charging Bear's expression was more guarded, his posture tense with barely contained emotion. "You should not have come," he said in English, though his voice held no anger, only concern. "Your soldiers seek blood." Rebecca sat down, her bucket studding his face in the moonlight. "Did your people attack the trading post?" The directness of her question seemed to surprise him. He had expected fear, accusations, perhaps demands that he leave her alone. Instead, she stood there waiting for truth, her scarred face calm and attentive. "Not my band," he said finally. "But yes, my people." Young warriors angry at broken promises, at land taken, at families starving because the buffalo grow fewer each season. His honesty struck her like a physical blow. She had somehow hoped he would deny it completely, that the violence could be dismissed as rumor or misunderstanding. Instead, he was acknowledging a reality that made their tentative connection seem impossible. "You came here anyway," she observed, even knowing the danger. Charging Bear stepped closer, and in the silvered light she could see the conflict playing out across his features. "I had to know you were safe. The young men who threatened you, they speak of revenge now, of taking their anger out on anyone they see as weak or different." The implication sent a chill through Rebecca. She had been so focused on the threat from native raids that she hadn't considered how the settlement's fear might turn inward, seeking scapegoats among their own people. "Why do you care what happens to me?" The question escaped before she could stop it, raw and vulnerable in the night air. For a long moment, Charging Bear said nothing. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were translating not just language but entire worlds of meaning. "In my people's way of seeing, every person carries a spirit light. Most learn to hide it, to dim it so they fit with others. But some—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Some have their light tested by fire, by pain, by the cruelty of others. Those who survive with their light still burning, they shine brighter than all the rest." Rebecca stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. No one had ever spoken to her about light, about surviving fire. Her hand moved unconsciously to touch her scars, but for once the gesture didn't feel like shame. "I don't feel bright," she whispered. Because you see with their eyes instead of your own. Charging Bear's voice was gentle but firm. You let their blindness become yours. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of horses and shouting men. Both Rebecca and Charging Bear tensed, recognizing the signs of a search party forming at the settlement. They're looking for signs of your people, Rebecca said urgently. You have to go. But Charging Bear was studying her face with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. Will you come here tomorrow night? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they should cross. Rebecca knew that meeting him again would be dangerous beyond measure, not just because of the military orders, but because of the way he made her feel seen, valued, worthy of protection and consideration. I shouldn't, she said, even as part of her was already planning how to slip away from the cabin unnoticed. But you will? Their eyes met and held, and Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of bonds she hadn't even realized were there. For the first time in years, someone was asking her to make a choice based on what she wanted rather than what was safe or proper. Yes, she breathed. Charging Bear nodded once and melted back into the shadows just as the first torchlight appeared through the trees. Rebecca grabbed her water bucket and hurried toward the settlement, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Captain Morrison's patrols had found tracks near the creek, evidence of native presence that sent the settlement into heightened alert. Rebecca went about her usual tasks with mechanical precision. While her mind raced with anticipation and doubt, the danger of her situation was becoming clearer with each passing hour. If she were caught meeting with a Blackfoot warrior, the consequences would be severe not just for her, but for her mother as well. They might be driven from the settlement entirely, left to face the wilderness with no protection and no means of survival. Yet as evening approached, Rebecca found herself unable to resist the pull of the planned meeting. Something had awakened in her during that brief conversation by the creek, a sense of possibility she had never dared to entertain. After Sarah fell asleep, Rebecca slipped from the cabin and made her way through the darkened settlement. The guards were focused outward, watching for threats from beyond the perimeter, which made it easier for her to move undetected toward the creek. Charging Bear was waiting, but this time he wasn't alone. An older Blackfoot woman sat nearby her, weathered face serene in the moonlight. Rebecca hesitated, uncertain whether she was walking into a trap or being granted some kind of honor. This is my grandmother, Singing Crane, Charging Bear said, switching to English for Rebecca's benefit. She wished to see the young woman who has captured her grandson's attention. The elderly woman studied Rebecca with keen, intelligent eyes. When she spoke, it was in Blackfoot, the liquid syllables flowing like water over stones. Charging Bear translated, though Rebecca sensed he was editing the words. She says your scars tell a story of survival. She asks if you know that fire purifies, as well as destroys. Rebecca found herself stepping closer to the old woman, drawn by something in her expression, a compassion that seemed to encompass pain without being diminished by it. Tell her I know fire destroys, Rebecca said quietly. I'm still learning about the other part. Singing Crane's eyes crinkled with what might have been approval. She spoke again, longer this time, her words carrying the rhythm of ceremony or storytelling. She says that in the old stories, the most powerful medicine comes from those who have walked through fire and chosen to help others rather than become fire themselves. She says you have the mark of a healer, not just the mark of the burned. The words hit Rebecca like a physical force. She had spent so many years seeing her scars as evidence of damage, of something broken that could never be whole again. The idea that they might represent something else entirely, strength, wisdom, the capacity to understand others' pain, was almost too overwhelming to accept. I don't know how to be what she sees, Rebecca admitted. This time Charging Bear answered for himself. You already are. You came to meet me despite the danger, not because you're reckless, but because you recognize something true between us. That takes courage most people never find. Singing Crane rose from her seated position with the fluid grace of someone much younger. She approached Rebecca slowly, giving her time to retreat if she chose. Instead, Rebecca found herself standing still as the older woman reached out and gently traced the scars along her cheek. The touch was surprisingly warm, calloused fingers mapping the ridged skin with careful attention. When Singing Crane spoke, again, her voice was soft but carrying absolute conviction. She says the spirits marked you for a purpose. Charging Bear translated. That your path will require you to bridge two worlds that have forgotten how to see each other clearly. Rebecca felt tears starting behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from a relief so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. Someone saw purpose in her pain, meaning in her isolation, strength in what she had always considered weakness. The sound of approaching horses cut through the moment like a blade. This time the search party was closer, their voices carrying clearly through the night air. Find any sign of those savages and we'll track them down, came Thomas Garrett's voice, slurred with alcohol and bravado. It's time they learned what happens when they threaten civilized people. Singing Crane and Charging Bear exchanged rapid words in Blackfoot. The old woman moved toward the trees with surprising speed, but Charging Bear lingered, his eyes fixed on Rebecca's face. This cannot continue, he said urgently. The danger grows too great. I know, Rebecca whispered, though every fiber of her being protested the admission. But I will not stop hoping, he added, his voice carrying a promise that made her heart race. If there is a way ... He disappeared into the darkness just as torchlight began flickering through the trees. Rebecca grabbed her water bucket and forced herself to walk calmly toward the settlement, though her mind was spinning with everything that had just occurred. Behind her, she could hear the search party thrashing through the underbrush, their crude shouts echoing across the water. But their words seemed to come from another world entirely, a world of hatred and fear that suddenly felt much smaller than the vast possibility that had opened before her as she slipped back into the cabin where her mother slept peacefully. Rebecca understood that something fundamental had changed. The girl who had left that evening was not the same one who returned. She had been seen, truly seen, by people who looked beyond surface scars to the spirit beneath. Now she faced the most difficult question of her life. What was she willing to risk to hold on to that recognition, and what price would both worlds demand for a love that crossed every boundary they held sacred? 3 weeks passed without another meeting, but the absence only intensified what had begun between Rebecca and Charging Bear. Fort Benton had transformed into an armed camp, with patrols doubled and a newly constructed watchtower overlooking the creek where their encounters had taken place. Captain Morrison had received reports of increased native activity throughout the region, and tensions were reaching a breaking point. Rebecca found herself caught between two forms of isolation. The heightened security made it impossible to venture beyond the settlement's boundaries, yet her brief taste of genuine connection had made the familiar walls feel more suffocating than ever. She moved through her daily routines like a sleepwalker, her mind constantly returning to those precious moments by the creek. The other settlers, already suspicious of anyone they considered different, began to view Rebecca with increased wariness. Her habit of gazing toward the distant hills had been noticed, and whispers followed her more frequently than before. Martha Henderson had begun spreading rumors that the burned girl might be in league with the savages, pointing to her solitary walks and strange behavior as evidence. I don't like the way she looks at those hills, Martha confided to Eleanor Patterson while Rebecca was within earshot, collecting laundry from the general store. Mark my words, that girl's trouble. Always has been, with that devil's mark on her face. Rebecca's fingers tightened on the bundle of clothes, but she kept walking. She had endured years of such comments, but now they carried additional weight. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being accused of exactly what she was guilty of, yet for entirely different reasons than they imagined. Sarah noticed her daughter's increasing withdrawal, but attributed it to the settlement's hostile atmosphere. The older woman had been watching the suspicious glances and hearing the whispered conversations, and her protective instincts were fully aroused. "Perhaps we should consider moving on," Sarah suggested one evening as they worked by candlelight. "There are other settlements, other opportunities." Rebecca looked up sharply. The thought of leaving felt like abandoning the only place where she had ever been truly seen. "Where would we go? What would be different anywhere else?" "Maybe nothing," Sarah admitted. "But staying here feels increasingly dangerous. I've seen how these frontier communities turn on outsiders when fear takes hold." Before Rebecca could respond, shouting erupted outside their cabin. Through the window, they could see torches moving toward the settlement center, accompanied by angry voices and the thunder of hoofbeats. Both women grabbed their shawls and joined the crowd gathering. Around Captain Morrison's headquarters, the news was devastating. A family of settlers 30 miles east had been found dead, their homestead burned, their livestock driven off. The discovery had sent shockwaves throughout the territory, and Fort Benton's residents were demanding immediate retaliation. "We can't let this stand," Thomas Garrett shouted above the crowd's murmur. "Every day we wait gives them time to strike again." Captain Morrison raised his hands for silence. "I understand your anger, but we must proceed carefully. We don't know which band was responsible, and attacking innocent people will only escalate the conflict." "Innocent?" scoffed James Patterson. "They're all savages. The only good Indian is a dead Indian." The crowd's approval of this sentiment chilled Rebecca to the bone. She thought of Singing Crane's gentle touch, of Charging Bear's protective presence, and felt sick at the bloodthirsty hatred surrounding her. "What about a prisoner exchange?" suggested Dr. William Hayes, the settlement's physician and one of its few voices of moderation. "Perhaps we could negotiate with murderers?" Thomas interrupted. "You're as soft as that scarred girl who probably sympathizes with them anyway." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Rebecca felt every eye in the crowd turned toward her, and the hostility was palpable. She tried to step backward, to disappear into the shadows, but Thomas wasn't finished. "I've seen her staring off toward their camps," he continued, emboldened by the crowd's attention. "Walking alone at all hours, acting strange. Maybe we should be asking what she knows about these attacks." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Rebecca felt her mother's hand grip her arm protectively, but Sarah's face had gone pale with fear. They both understood how quickly suspicion could turn to violence in a community gripped by terror. "That's enough," Captain Morrison said firmly. "Miss Thornton has lived here peacefully for 3 years. She's not our enemy." But Rebecca could see doubt flickering in some faces, and she knew that Morrison's protection might not be enough if hysteria continued to grow. The crowd eventually dispersed, but the damage was done. She and her mother were now marked as potential threats, objects of suspicion in a community that had barely tolerated them before. That night, as Sarah slept fitfully, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't continue living in limbo, caught between two worlds that both seemed determined to reject her. If she was going to be accused of treachery anyway, perhaps it was time to embrace the connection that had given her the only genuine happiness she had ever known. She slipped from the cabin and made her way toward the creek, moving with desperate purpose rather than her usual caution. The watchtower was manned, but she knew the guard patterns by now and managed to reach the familiar meeting spot undetected. Charging Bear wasn't there, but she hadn't expected him to be. The increased patrols made their previous meeting arrangement impossible. Instead, she sat by the water and waited, hoping against hope that somehow he would sense her presence. Hours passed. The moon traveled across the sky, and still she waited. Just as dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, she heard the soft whistle of a meadowlark, a sound she had never heard at night. Charging Bear emerged from the reeds along the creek bank, moving like a shadow given form. But his expression was grim, and she could see fresh cuts on his arms and face. "You should not have come," he said, though his eyes betrayed his relief at seeing her. "The soldiers search everywhere now." "I had to see you," Rebecca said simply. "They're planning to attack your people. There's going to be war." He nodded grimly. "We know. My band is preparing to move deeper into the mountains, away from the settlements. It is no longer safe for any of us here." The implications of his words struck her like a physical blow. If his people left, she would never see him again. The brief glimpse of connection, of being truly seen and valued, would vanish like smoke. "Take me with you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Charging Bear stared at her in shock. "You do not understand what you ask. Life is hard, dangerous. Your people would consider you dead to them." "My people already consider me dead," Rebecca replied with bitter honesty. "I'm an outcast here, just as I would be anywhere among the whites. At least with your band, I might find acceptance." "My grandmother spoke of this possibility," Charging Bear admitted slowly. "She said the spirits sometimes call people to cross between worlds, to serve as bridges. But the path is treacherous, and there is no returning once it is chosen." Rebecca thought of the hatred in Thomas Garrett's eyes, of her mother's constant worry, of the years stretching ahead in one settlement after another. Always the scarred girl, always the outsider. Then she thought of Singing Crane's gentle touch, and the way Charging Bear looked at her, not with pity or revulsion, but with recognition of her worth. "There's nothing for me to return to," she said quietly. "But I won't go if it would bring danger to your people." Charging Bear was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the growing light. "There would be those who oppose it," he said. "Finally, white captives are one thing, they can be ransomed or traded. But someone who chooses to join us is different. More complicated. I'm not asking for an easy path," Rebecca said. "I'm asking for a chance to belong somewhere, to be valued for who I am rather than pitied for what I'm not." The sound of approaching horses cut through their conversation. This time the patrol was closer, and there would be no time for Charging Bear to disappear unnoticed. "3 days," he said urgently, already moving toward the reeds. "If you truly mean this, meet me at the old trading post ruins 5 miles north. At sunset, come prepared to leave everything behind." "I will," Rebecca promised, but he was already gone, vanished into the morning mist like a spirit dot as she hurried back toward the settlement. Rebecca's mind raced with the magnitude of what she had just committed to. In 3 days, she would either begin a new life among people who might accept her despite her differences, or she would die in the attempt. Either outcome seemed preferable to the slow suffocation of remaining where she was neither wanted nor valued. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and agonizing decision-making. Rebecca gathered what few possessions she could carry without arousing suspicion: her warmest clothes, her mother's small sewing kit, the silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. Each item felt like a farewell to the only life she had ever known. The hardest part was watching her mother, knowing she would soon abandon the one person who had never stopped loving her despite everything. Sarah had sacrificed so much for her scarred daughter, had endured years of hardship and social isolation. The thought of repaying that devotion with abandonment was almost unbearable. On the final evening, as Sarah prepared for bed, Rebecca almost lost her resolve. Her mother looked so fragile, so worn down by years of struggle and worry. How could she add the grief of a missing daughter to that burden? But then she remembered Thomas Garrett's accusations, the suspicion in the crowd's eyes, the whispers that followed her everywhere. Staying would only bring more danger to her mother, more suspicion, and potential violence. Perhaps her disappearance would actually protect Sarah by removing the target of the community's growing paranoia. As sunset approached on the third day, Rebecca left a letter for her mother, brief, loving, and deliberately vague about her intentions. She couldn't risk revealing the truth, but she hoped Sarah would understand that this was a choice made from hope rather than despair. Walking toward the abandoned trading post, Rebecca felt as if she were shedding her old skin, leaving behind the frightened girl who had defined herself by her scars and limitations. Whatever waited ahead, acceptance or rejection, life or death, she was finally choosing her own path, rather than accepting the one others had chosen for her. The ruins came into view just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And there, silhouetted against the dying light, stood Charging Bear, waiting to guide her across the threshold between worlds. The journey into Blackfoot territory took 4 days, traveling only at night and hiding during daylight hours when army patrols might spot them. Rebecca had expected hardship, but nothing had prepared her for the complete transformation of her existence. Every familiar comfort was stripped away: soft beds, regular meals, the security of walls and doors between her and the wilderness. Charging Bear moved through the landscape like he was part of it, reading signs in broken twigs and disturbed earth that were invisible to Rebecca's untrained eyes. He taught her to walk without snapping branches, to choose her steps carefully on rocky ground that wouldn't hold footprints, to recognize the difference between natural forest sounds and those that might signal danger. "Your people make a lot of noise," he observed on the second night as they rested in a hidden canyon. "They move through the world like they own it, without listening to what it tells them." Rebecca flexed her sore feet and tried to ignore the growing blisters inside her leather boots. "We're not taught to listen, only to conquer." The comment seemed to please him. "That is why most whites who come to live with us fail. They try to bring their old ways instead of learning new ones. You must decide which you will choose." By the third day, Rebecca's body was adapting to the constant movement, but her mind struggled with deeper adjustments. Every mile took her further from everything she had ever known, into a world where her pale skin and English words marked her as foreign. Doubt crept in during the long hours of walking. What if Charging Bear's people rejected her completely? What if she had made a terrible mistake that would cost both of them their lives? These fears were temporarily forgotten when they reached the Blackfoot camp on the 4th evening. Hidden in a valley protected by steep ridges, the encampment consisted of nearly 30 lodges arranged in careful patterns Rebecca didn't understand. Smoke rose from cook fires, and she could hear the sounds of children playing, women talking, men discussing the day's hunt. The normalcy of it surprised her. She had expected something more primitive, more savage than what she saw. Instead, this looked like a community different from Fort Benton in its materials and arrangements, but familiar in its essential humanity. Their arrival was noticed immediately. Warriors emerged from lodges, their faces hard and suspicious. As they took in the sight of Charging Bear, accompanied by a white woman, Rebecca felt the weight of their stares and unconsciously raised her hand to cover her scarred cheek. "Do not hide," Charging Bear said quietly. "They must see all of who you are." An older man approached them, his bearing suggesting authority. This was Standing Wolf, the band's war chief, and his expression was anything but welcoming. He spoke rapidly in Blackfoot, his tone sharp with questions and accusations. Rebecca didn't need translation to understand that her presence was causing serious concern. Bear responded calmly but firmly, and Rebecca caught her own name mentioned several times. The conversation continued for several minutes while a crowd gathered around them, women and children all staring at the white woman who had somehow appeared in their midst. Finally, Standing Wolf turned his attention directly to Rebecca. When he spoke in heavily accented English, his words were like stones thrown into still water. "You bring trouble to our people. White woman missing from the settlement means soldiers will come looking. Why should we risk our families for one scarred white girl? The bluntness of the question took Rebecca's breath away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Because I have nowhere else to go, and because your grandson saw something in me worth protecting. Standing Wolf's eyes narrowed. Charging Bear is not my grandson. You know nothing of our ways, our relationships. Already you speak from ignorance. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Singing Crane emerged from one of the larger lodges, moving with the quiet authority of someone whose wisdom was universally respected. The old woman approached Rebecca directly, ignoring the muttered objections from some of the gathered warriors. She spoke in Blackfoot, her words flowing like a gentle river, and gradually the hostile murmurs around them began to quiet. When Singing Crane finished speaking, she reached out and took Rebecca's hands in hers. The gesture was clearly significant, and Rebecca could see surprise on several faces in the crowd. Standing Wolf looked troubled, but not entirely convinced. The grandmother speaks of visions, of signs from the spirits. But visions do not stop bullets or prevent soldiers from burning our lodges. Neither does turning away someone the spirits have marked for a purpose. Singing Crane replied in English, her words careful but clear. This one carries medicine we will need. Her scars are not marks of weakness. They are proof she has walked through fire and emerged whole. The debate continued for nearly an hour, with various band members expressing their opinions. Rebecca stood silently through it all, understanding that her fate was being decided by people who had every reason to reject her. Some argued that harboring a white woman would bring disaster upon them all. Others pointed out that she had chosen to leave her own people, which suggested either courage or madness, and both could be valuable in their own ways. Finally, the band's peace chief, an elderly man named Tall Elk, spoke for the first time. His words carried the weight of final judgment. "We will allow her to stay through the winter," he announced. "She will be watched, tested, judged by her actions rather than her birth. If she proves herself worthy of our trust, she may remain. If not," he left the consequences unspoken. Charging Bear's relief was visible, though he tried to hide it. Rebecca felt her knees weaken with a mixture of gratitude and terror. She had been granted a chance, nothing more. Everything depended on her ability to prove herself to people whose ways she barely understood. Singing Crane took charge of Rebecca's integration into the community. The old woman led her to a small lodge that would serve as her temporary home. Explaining through a mixture of English and gestures what would be expected of her. "You must learn our language quickly," Singing Crane said as they arranged buffalo robes for sleeping. "Words are the beginning of understanding. Without understanding, there's no trust." "What if I can't learn fast enough?" Rebecca asked, voicing her deepest fear. Singing Crane studied her with those keen eyes that seemed to see through flesh to spirit. "The mind that survived fire and kept its light burning will not fail at words. But you must stop thinking like a white woman and start feeling like one of the people." The first weeks were the hardest of Rebecca's life. Every day brought new challenges, new customs to learn, new ways of failing to meet expectations. The Blackfoot language seemed impossible, full of sounds her English-trained tongue couldn't produce, and concepts that had no equivalent in her native speech. The women of the band were polite but distant, watching her attempts to help with daily tasks and quietly correcting her mistakes. Rebecca burned food, ruined hides by tanning them incorrectly, and struggled with even basic tasks like setting up a proper fire. Her soft hands, accustomed to needle and thread rather than hard labor, blistered and cracked from the constant work, but gradually small victories began to accumulate. Her language skills improved daily, and she discovered an unexpected aptitude for beadwork. Her years of detailed sewing translated well to the intricate patterns that decorated clothing and ceremonial items. When a child in the camp developed a fever, her knowledge of herbal remedies learned from her mother proved valuable. earning her the first grudging respect from some of the women. Charging Bear remained a constant presence, but their relationship had to be carefully managed. Among his people, courtship followed specific protocols, and Rebecca's uncertain status made everything more complicated. They spoke often but always in the presence of others, sharing knowledge and growing understanding while the community watched and judged. "You are changing," he observed one evening as they worked together to repair a damaged lodge covering. "Your face is different, stronger, more certain." Rebecca considered this. It was true that she felt different, though she couldn't entirely identify the source of the change. Perhaps it was the constant physical challenges, or maybe the fact that her scars drew no particular attention here. They were simply part of her appearance, neither hidden nor emphasized. "I feel like I'm becoming someone I was always meant to be," she said carefully. "But I'm not sure who that person is yet." "She is someone worth the risk I took in bringing you here," Charging Bear replied quietly. "Someone worth the patience my people are showing. Someone worth the faith my grandmother placed in her visions." As winter deepened and the band settled into their protected valley, Rebecca began to understand that she was living through a trial by ordeal. Every day she remained, every task she completed, every word she learned in their language was a step toward acceptance or rejection. The scarred white girl from Fort Benton was as dying slowly, replaced by someone harder, more resilient, more connected to the natural world around her. But she also knew that spring would bring a final reckoning. When the snows melted and travel became easier, the band would need to decide whether she had truly become one of them or remained forever an outsider who posed too great a risk to their survival. The answer to that question would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the love that had brought her across the divide between two worlds at war. Spring arrived with devastating news. A hunting party returning from the Eastern Territories brought word that Fort Benton had dispatched search parties throughout the region, offering a substantial reward for information about the missing white woman. More troubling still, several Blackfoot bands had been attacked by army units seeking Rebecca's whereabouts, turning her rescue into a catalyst for broader conflict. Standing Wolf's prediction had come to pass with brutal accuracy. Rebecca's disappearance had indeed brought soldiers to their doorstep, and innocent people were paying the price for her choices. 3 lodges burned at the Beaver Creek camp, reported Swift Runner, the lead scout. 2 elders dead, children scattered to hide in the mountains. The soldiers said they would continue until the white woman returned. Rebecca listened to the grim recital with growing horror. She had fled Fort Benton to escape being a burden, only to become a different kind of burden, one that endangered entire communities. The weight of unintended consequences pressed down on her like a physical force. Standing Wolf's gaze found her across the circle of gathered adults. "The time for charity has ended," he said with cold finality. "She must go back, or we must move far from this territory and abandon the graves of our ancestors." Several voices rose in agreement, but Singing Crane held up a weathered hand for silence. "The spirits do not make mistakes," she said firmly. "If walking through fire was meant to return to the white world, she would not have survived the winter among us." Rebecca started at hearing herself called by a Blackfoot name. During the long winter months, the band had begun referring to her this way, a recognition of her survival and transformation that she hadn't fully realized until now. "Names do not stop bullets, grandmother," Standing Wolf replied with weary patience. "The woman's presence has brought war to our people. Sentiment cannot outweigh survival." "Neither can fear," Tall Elk interjected unexpectedly. The peace chief had remained largely silent about Rebecca's status throughout the winter, but now his voice carried new authority. "We face a choice that will define what kind of people we are. Do we abandon those the spirits have sent to us at the first sign of trouble? Or do we trust in the wisdom that has guided our people for generations?" The debate raged for hours, with the band fundamentally split between those who saw Rebecca as a dangerous liability, and those who believed her presence served a larger purpose. Rebecca herself remained silent, understanding that speaking would only inflame tensions further. Finally, Charging Bear rose to address the council. Throughout the winter, he had been careful not to appear too partisan in Rebecca's defense, knowing it would undermine her chances of acceptance. But now, with her fate hanging in the balance, he could no longer remain neutral. "I brought walking through fire to our people because the spirits showed me her true nature," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed circle. "She has proven herself worthy of the name she bears. To cast her out now would be to reject not just her, but the guidance that led us to accept her." "Pretty words," Standing Wolf replied harshly. "But words will not protect our children when the soldiers come. Your romantic feelings cloud your judgment, young warrior." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral fire. Charging Bear's face hardened, but before he could respond, Rebecca finally spoke. "There is another choice," she said in careful Blackfoot, her accent still noticeable but her meaning clear. "I can go to the soldiers myself. Not as someone returning in defeat, but as someone carrying a message from your people to mine." The suggestion created an immediate stir. Several warriors laughed dismissively, but Tall Elk leaned forward with interest. What message could a white woman carry that soldiers would hear? He asked. Rebecca took a deep breath, knowing her next words would either seal her fate or create new possibilities. That peace is still possible. That not all whites seek war, just as not all Blackfoot seek conflict. Someone must speak for understanding before the killing goes too far to stop. "They will arrest you as a traitor," Standing Wolf pointed out. "Or worse, as someone who has been contaminated by savage ways." "Perhaps," Rebecca acknowledged. "But if I approach them correctly, I might be able to prevent further attacks on your people while I try to negotiate safe passage for the band." Singing. Crane's eyes had taken on a distant look, as if she were seeing visions in the fire's flames. "The bridge between worlds," she murmured. "This is why the spirits marked her, why they guided her to us. Not to hide among the people, but to stand between the people and those who would destroy them." The old woman's words carried weight that went beyond mere opinion. As the band's most respected medicine woman, her interpretations of spiritual guidance were rarely questioned. But Standing Wolf was not easily swayed by mystical pronouncements. "Even if we accepted this plan," he said skeptically, "how would she convince the soldiers to listen? They seek vengeance, not negotiation." Rebecca had been considering this question throughout the long debate. "Because I know their leader," she said quietly. "Captain Morrison is not a cruel man, just a cautious one. If I can reach him before his superiors demand more aggressive action, there might be a chance for dialogue." "And if you fail?" Charging Bear asked, his voice tight with concern. "If they arrest you or worse?" Rebecca met his eyes across the fire, seeing her own fears reflected there. "Then at least I will have tried to repay the kindness your people showed me. Better to risk everything for a chance at peace than to hide while others suffer for my choices." The council debated through the night, with positions shifting as various arguments were presented and considered. Some saw Rebecca's proposal as naive idealism, while others recognized it as potentially their best option for avoiding a devastating war. By dawn, a fragile consensus had emerged. Rebecca would be allowed to approach Fort Benton under a flag of truce, carrying proposals for a peaceful resolution to the current crisis. If she succeeded in establishing dialogue, the band would participate in formal negotiations. If she failed or was harmed, they would consider all agreements void and act purely in their own defense. The next 3 days were spent in intensive preparation. Tall Elk and the other elders crafted carefully worded proposals that offered compromises without surrendering essential rights. Rebecca practiced her presentation repeatedly, knowing she would have only one chance to make her case before suspicious military officials. Charging Bear, struggled visibly with the plan, torn between pride in Rebecca's courage and terror at the risks she was accepting. Their relationship had deepened throughout the winter, built on shared work, quiet conversations, and growing mutual respect. The possibility of losing her just as their bond was solidifying felt like a cruel twist of fate. "There must be another way," he said on the final evening before her departure. They sat apart from the main camp, speaking in the mixture of English and Blackfoot that had become their private language. "If there is, I cannot see it," Rebecca replied honestly. "Your people gave me a chance when they had every reason to refuse. Now it's my turn to take risks for something greater than my own safety. And if they execute you as a traitor, what greater purpose does that serve?" Rebecca considered the question seriously. "Maybe none," she admitted. "But hiding here while others die because of my presence serves no purpose at all. I've spent too many years being afraid of what might happen if I acted. I won't make that mistake again." The transformation in her was complete now, and both of them recognized it. The frightened, scarred girl who had fled Fort Benton had been replaced by a woman who understood her own worth and was willing to fight for what she believed in. As dawn broke on the day of her departure, the entire band gathered to witness Rebecca's leave-taking. Singing Crane presented her with a beaded medallion that carried protective medicine, while other women offered small gifts and words of encouragement. Standing Wolf, despite his opposition to the plan, approached her with something resembling respect. "You have earned the name Walking Through Fire," he said formally. "May the spirits guide your steps and bring you safely back to us." The words "back to us" struck Rebecca with unexpected force. Somewhere during the long winter, this community of strangers had become her people. She was no longer seeking acceptance. She had found belonging and was now fighting to protect it. Charging Bear rode with her to the edge of Blackfoot territory, where they could see Fort Benton's walls in the distance. The parting was brief, but intense, filled with unspoken promises and fears. "Come back to us," he said simply. "I will," Rebecca replied, though they both knew it was a promise that might be impossible to keep. As she rode alone toward the settlement that had once been her prison, Rebecca carried with her not just proposals for peace, but the hopes of two peoples who had forgotten how to see each other as anything but enemies. Her scars, once marks of shame, now felt like badges of survival and strength. The real test was about to begin. The guards at Fort Benton's gates nearly shot Rebecca on sight. After months of searching for the missing woman, the last thing they expected was for her to ride up alone under a white flag, dressed in Blackfoot clothing and speaking with quiet authority about negotiating peace. "Sweet Jesus," breathed Corporal Matthews, lowering his rifle with shaking hands. "It's the Thornton girl. She's alive." Word of Rebecca's return spread through the settlement like wildfire. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered, their faces displaying a mixture of relief, suspicion, and barely controlled hostility. Many had assumed she was dead, killed by the same savages who had been terrorizing the territory. Her appearance alive, unharmed, and clearly having lived among the enemy challenged everything they believed about Native intentions and white survival. Captain Morrison pushed through the crowd, his weathered face showing genuine surprise at seeing Rebecca alive. But his military training quickly reasserted itself as he took in her appearance, the Blackfoot clothing, the confident way she sat her horse, the absence of any signs of mistreatment or coercion. "Miss Thornton," he said carefully, "we had feared the worst. Where have you been these past months?" "Living with Pegam Blackfoot," Rebecca replied simply, making no attempt to soften the revelation. "Learning their ways, understanding their perspective on the conflicts that have brought us to the edge of war." The crowd's murmur turned ugly at her words. Someone shouted, "Traitor," while others demanded to know what had been done to her to make her sympathize with murderers. Thomas Garrett pushed to the front of the crowd, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "Look at her," he sneered. dressed like a savage, talking like she's one of them. They've poisoned her mind, turned her against her own people. I speak for myself, Rebecca said firmly, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd's hostility. And I carry proposals from Chief Tall Elk of the Piegan Band for ending the bloodshed before it consumes everyone. Morrison held up his hands for silence, though his own expression had grown troubled. We'll discuss this properly inside, he announced. Corporal Matthews, escort Miss Thornton to headquarters. The rest of you disperse. The crowd was reluctant to leave, and Rebecca could feel their hostile stares as she dismounted and followed Morrison toward the military compound. She noticed how different the settlement looked to her now smaller, more fragile, hemmed in by walls that seemed designed more to keep fear in than danger out. In Morrison's office, the captain studied Rebecca with the careful attention of a man trying to solve a puzzle. She had changed dramatically during her absence, and not just in her clothing. There was a strength in her bearing that hadn't been there before, a confidence that came from surviving tests he couldn't imagine. Tell me what happened, Morrison said simply. All of it. Rebecca had prepared for this moment during her long ride from Blackfoot territory. She knew that her credibility would depend on absolute honesty, even when the truth might be difficult for Morrison to accept. She told him about her meeting with Charging Bear, about the protection he had offered when Thomas Garrett and his friends had threatened her. She described the growing tensions that had made her feel unsafe in the settlement, and the desperate decision to seek sanctuary among people who had shown her more kindness than her own community. Morrison listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Rebecca finished her account, he leaned back in his chair and studied her carefully. You realize what you're telling me, he said slowly. That you voluntarily left this settlement to live among people we consider hostile. That you've adopted their dress, learned their language, accepted their protection. I'm telling you that I found acceptance among people who judged me by my character rather than my appearance. Rebecca replied. People who saw strength where others saw only damage. And now you expect me to believe that these same people sent you back here as some kind of peace negotiator. Rebecca reached into her leather satchel and withdrew the carefully prepared documents that Tall Elk and the elders had composed. They sent me back because they believe war serves no one's interests, because they hope there are still white leaders wise enough to choose dialogue over destruction. Morrison examined the papers, his eyebrows rising as he read the carefully crafted proposals. The terms were more reasonable than anything his superiors had expected: agreements to limit territorial conflicts, protocols for resolving disputes without violence, even offers to return stolen property in exchange for guarantees of safe passage. These are not the demands of savages, he admitted grudgingly. But how do I know they're sincere? How do I know this isn't some elaborate deception? Because they let me come back, Rebecca said simply. If they wanted war, they would have kept me as a hostage or killed me to prevent my testimony. Instead, they risked their own safety by sending someone who could tell you they're not the monsters you believe them to be. Before Morrison could respond, the office door burst open without ceremony. Colonel Harrison Sterling, the territorial military commander, strode in with the bearing of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. Rebecca had heard his name whispered in the settlement, a career officer known for his ruthless efficiency in dealing with native uprisings. So this is our missing girl, Sterling said, his voice dripping with contempt as he took in Rebecca's appearance. Though I'm not sure girl is the appropriate term for someone who's clearly gone native. Morrison rose respectfully. Colonel Sterling, I wasn't expecting. I came as soon as I received word of her return. Sterling interrupted. We have questions that need immediate answers. The colonel's attention fixed on Rebecca with predatory intensity. You will provide U.S. with detailed information about the band that held you captive. Numbers, weapons, camp locations, defensive capabilities. I wasn't held captive, Rebecca said quietly. I was welcomed as a guest. Sterling's face darkened. Don't play games with me, girl. No white woman goes willingly to live with savages unless her mind has been broken by trauma or corrupted by unnatural influences. My mind is clearer now than it's ever been, Rebecca replied, meeting his hostile gaze steadily. Clear enough to see that calling for more violence will only create more suffering for everyone. Violence? Sterling laughed harshly. These animals have murdered innocent families, burned homesteads, and terrorized honest settlers. They understand nothing but force. They understand betrayal, Rebecca countered. Broken treaties, stolen land, promises made and abandoned when convenient. They fight because they see no other choice for survival. The room fell silent at her words. Morrison looked uncomfortable, while Sterling's face had turned dangerously red. I see the savages have taught you their lies along with their dress, Sterling said coldly. No matter. You'll tell us what we need to know, willingly or otherwise. Colonel, Morrison interjected carefully, Miss Thornton has brought formal proposals for peace negotiations. Perhaps we should. There will be no negotiations with murderers, Sterling snapped. The only solution to the Indian problem is complete subjugation or elimination. This woman's sympathies have clearly been compromised by her ordeal. Rebecca felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly what Sergeant Bear and the others had feared that military leaders would be too, invested in conflict to consider peaceful alternatives. But she had come too far to give up now. The band that sheltered me had nothing to do with the attacks on settlers, she said firmly. They're willing to help identify those responsible and work toward justice that doesn't require more innocent deaths. Innocent? Sterling's voice rose. You call murdering savages innocent? I call children innocent, Rebecca replied with quiet force. Old people are innocent. Families trying to survive in a world that's changing too fast for anyone to understand. Just like the settler families you're trying to protect. The parallel clearly angered Sterling, but before he could respond, Morrison spoke up. The proposals she's brought deserve consideration, Colonel. If there's a chance to end this conflict without more bloodshed, Captain Morrison, you forget yourself, Sterling said icily. I'll decide what deserves consideration. As for this woman, she'll be confined pending a full investigation of her activities while missing. Rebecca felt the walls closing in around her, but she forced herself to remain calm. Confining me will accomplish nothing except proving to the Blackfoot that whites cannot be trusted to honor agreements. What agreements? Sterling demanded. Safe passage for a diplomatic messenger, Rebecca replied. Basic civilized behavior towards someone carrying proposals for peace. Sterling studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he turned to Morrison. You have 24 hours to extract useful military intelligence from this woman. After that, she'll be transferred to territorial custody for formal interrogation. The threat was clear, and Rebecca understood that her mission was failing. The military mind that controlled policy was too rigid to accept anything that challenged its preconceptions about the conflict. But as Sterling prepared to leave, Morrison spoke quietly. What if the proposals have merit, Colonel? What if we could end this without the casualties a full campaign would require? Sterling paused at the door. Captain, I've spent 20 years fighting Indians. They respect only strength, fear only overwhelming force. This woman's romantic notions about noble savages will get more people killed than saved. After the colonel left, Morrison and Rebecca sat in heavy silence. The weight of failed hopes filled the room like smoke from a dying fire. I'm sorry, Morrison said finally. I believe you're sincere, but Sterling has the authority here. There's nothing I can do to change his mind. Rebecca nodded, understanding that she had known this outcome was possible from the beginning. Will you at least read the proposals? Consider what they offer? I'll read them, Morrison promised. but I can't act on them without authorization. As evening fell over Fort Benton, Rebecca found herself confined to a small room in the military compound. Her diplomatic mission apparently ended before it had truly begun. Through her barred window, she could see the settlement's lights flickering like distant stars, and beyond them, the darkness that concealed the people who had become her true family. Tomorrow would bring interrogation, possible charges of treason, and the collapse of any hope for peaceful resolution. But tonight, she held on to the knowledge that she had tried to bridge two worlds, even if those worlds seemed determined to remain forever divided by fear and misunderstanding. Dawn brought the sound of boots on wooden floors and the jangle of keys outside Rebecca's confinement room. She had spent the night in fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of burning lodges and the faces of Blackfoot children she had come to know. The failure of her mission weighed on her like a physical burden, made worse by the knowledge that Colonel Sterling's rigid approach would likely lead to exactly the kind of devastating conflict she had hoped to prevent. Captain Morrison entered. With 2 armed guards, his expression grim but not unkind. "Miss Thornton, I'm afraid Colonel Sterling has decided to accelerate the timeline. You're to be transferred to territorial headquarters within the hour." Rebecca rose from the narrow cot, smoothing her Blackfoot dress with hands that trembled. "Only slightly. For interrogation?" "Among other things," Morrison replied carefully. "The Colonel believes you may have information about planned attacks that could save lives if extracted quickly." The euphemism wasn't lost on Rebecca. She understood that extraction might involve methods far removed from polite conversation. The territorial authorities had ways of making people talk, especially those they considered traitors to their own race. "Captain Morrison," she said quietly, "there will be no planned attacks if the Blackfoot believe I've been treated honorably. But if they learn I've been imprisoned or worse..." She left the implication hanging. Morrison's jaw tightened. He had read Tall Elk's proposals thoroughly during the night, and despite his military training, he could see the wisdom in seeking peaceful resolution. The terms offered were more generous than anything likely to emerge from armed conflict, and the potential for avoiding casualties on both sides was enormous. "The Colonel sees things differently," he said with obvious reluctance. "He believes the only message worth sending is one delivered through overwhelming force." Before Rebecca could respond, commotion erupted outside the building. Shouting voices, running feet, and the unmistakable sound of horses arriving at speed filled the morning air. Morrison moved to the window, his face paling as he took in what was happening. "What is it?" Rebecca asked, though part of her already. "New Blackfoot riders," Morrison said tersely. "Just outside the rifle range, flying a white flag." Rebecca's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and terror. Charging Bear had come for her, she was certain of it. But his presence would only confirm Sterling's worst suspicions about her loyalties and the danger she represented. "I have to speak with them," she said urgently. "If they've come this far, it means the band is taking enormous risks. They need to know what's happening." Morrison hesitated, clearly torn between duty and conscience. The sound of Sterling's voice, barking orders outside, made the decision for him. "I can't authorize that," he said formally, but his eyes held a different message. "However, if you were to accidentally encounter them during transport to the territorial headquarters... The captain's meaning was clear, and Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude for his subtle defiance of orders. Morrison was a career soldier, but he was also a decent man who could see beyond the prejudices that blinded his superiors. As they prepared to leave the building, Rebecca caught sight of the Blackfoot party through the window. 5 riders sat motionless on their horses, waiting, with the patience of people accustomed to reading the wind and weather for signs of change. Even at a distance, she could recognize Charging Bear's distinctive posture and the way he held his head when scanning for danger. Colonel Sterling was already organizing a response, deploying soldiers in defensive positions while keeping the riders under constant observation. His voice carried clearly across the compound as he issued orders. No one approaches them without my direct authorization. They're here for intelligence gathering or to rescue their agent. Either way, we don't. Give them what they want. The casual reference to Rebecca as their agent stung. But she understood it revealed Sterling's fundamental inability to conceive of any relationship between whites and natives that wasn't based on deception or coercion. As Morrison escorted her toward the waiting wagon that would transport her to territorial custody, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. Instead of walking docilely to her fate, she broke away from her guards and ran toward the settlement's main gate. "Rebecca, stop!" Morrison shouted, but she could hear admiration mixed with his alarm. The guards raised their weapons, but Morrison's sharp command prevented them from firing. Rebecca reached the gate just as Sterling arrived with a squad of soldiers, his face purple with rage. "Seize her!" he commanded, but Rebecca was already calling out in Blackfoot to the waiting riders. Her words carried across the open ground between the settlement and the delegation, a mixture of warning, explanation, and desperate hope. She told them about Sterling's refusal to consider peace, about the planned interrogation, about the colonel's determination to pursue military solutions regardless of cost. Charging Bear's response came back in the same language, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. He spoke of the band's concern for her safety, of their willingness to honor agreements even when the other side proved faithless, of their readiness to defend themselves if forced to choose between war and abandonment of their principles. "What are they saying?" Sterling demanded, grabbing Rebecca's arm roughly. "What intelligence are you passing to them?" "I'm telling them that some white leaders prefer hatred to understanding," Rebecca replied in English, her voice carrying to both the soldiers and the Blackfoot riders. "That fear makes cowards of men who should be seeking wisdom." Sterling's backhanded blow sent Rebecca stumbling, but she kept her feet and her dignity. The violence of his response was visible to everyone present, including the Blackfoot delegation, and its meaning was unmistakable. Charging Bear's voice rose again, this time with the edge of controlled fury. He was speaking directly to Sterling now, though the colonel couldn't understand the words. Rebecca translated without being asked. "He says that striking a woman who came in peace proves which people are truly savage. He says the spirits will judge men by their treatment of those who seek to build bridges rather than burn them." "Enough of this nonsense," Sterling snarled. "Guards, remove her from—" His words were cut off by the arrival of a lone rider approaching from the east. The man wore the dusty uniform of a territorial courier, and his urgent pace suggested news of considerable importance. He dismounted near Sterling and handed over a sealed dispatch, speaking quickly in words too quiet for others to hear. Sterling's face went through a remarkable transformation as he read the message, from fury to surprise to something that might have been fear. He read it twice, then looked up at the Blackfoot delegation with new wariness. "It seems there's been a development," he said slowly. "Washington has received reports about the territorial situation. There are questions about military conduct, about whether all peaceful options have been exhausted before resorting to force." Rebecca felt a surge of hope. Someone in the distant capital was asking the right questions, challenging the assumption that violence was the only solution to frontier conflicts. "What does that mean for the peace proposals?" Morrison asked carefully. Sterling's jaw worked as he wrestled with implications that clearly displeased him. "It means I'm instructed to explore all diplomatic alternatives before initiating major military operations. It means this woman's proposals will receive official consideration." The admission was clearly painful for him, but the authority of Washington was not something even a territorial colonel could ignore. Rebecca understood that political pressure from the capital had accomplished what moral arguments could not force in reconsideration of peaceful alternatives. "And what about me?" she asked quietly. Sterling studied her with barely concealed animosity. "You'll remain under military protection while negotiations proceed. Your safety is apparently considered important to the success of any diplomatic initiative." The phrase military protection could mean many things, but in the current context, Rebecca chose to interpret it optimistically. She was being kept safe rather than imprisoned, at least for the moment. Charging Bear called out again, his voice questioning and concerned. Rebecca responded in Blackfoot, explaining the change in circumstances and the possibility that negotiations might actually proceed. "Tell them they can return to their people," Sterling commanded. "Formal talks will begin within the week if Chief Tall Elk agrees to meet at a neutral location." Rebecca translated the offer, her heart racing with the realization that her desperate mission might actually succeed. The diplomatic breakthrough felt fragile, dependent on political pressures she didn't fully understand. But it was real. As the Blackfoot delegation prepared to depart, Charging Bear's eyes found Rebecca across the distance. Their gaze held for a long moment, communicating emotions that transcended language: love, hope, determination to see this through regardless of personal cost. "1 week," Rebecca called out in English, knowing he would understand at least that much. "Tell Tall Elk 1 week." As the riders disappeared into the distance, Rebecca felt the weight of enormous responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had succeeded in opening a door to peace, but keeping it open would require navigating between two peoples who had grown accustomed to seeing each other as enemies. The scarred girl who had once hidden in shadows was about to become the bridge between worlds at war, carrying the hopes of everyone who believed that understanding could triumph over hatred. Whether she could bear that weight remained to be seen, but for the first time in her life, Rebecca felt truly worthy of the challenges that lay ahead. The neutral ground chosen for the peace negotiations was a meadow beside the Missouri River, 15 miles from both Fort Benton and the nearest Blackfoot camp. Ancient cottonwoods provided shade for the gathering, their rustling leaves creating a natural cathedral for what everyone understood might be the last chance to prevent a devastating war. Rebecca arrived with the military delegation, riding beside Captain Morrison in a wagon loaded with supplies for the 3-day conference. Colonel Sterling commanded the escort, his presence a reminder that the Army's commitment to diplomacy remained grudging at best. Behind them came territorial officials, interpreters, and a small contingent of soldiers whose job was officially described as protection, but who clearly viewed the proceedings with deep suspicion. The Blackfoot delegation was already present when the White Party arrived. Chief Tall Elk sat in the place of honor, flanked by other tribal leaders Rebecca had come to know during her winter among them. Singing Crane was there as well, her weathered face serene despite the momentous nature of the gathering. And standing slightly apart, watching the approaching wagons with barely concealed tension, was Charging Bear. The formal greeting ceremony took nearly an hour, with each side observing protocols designed to demonstrate respect and peaceful intentions. Rebecca found herself in the unique position of understanding both sets of customs, helping to bridge misunderstandings before they could escalate into offense. When Colonel Sterling made the mistake of approaching Chief Tall Elk with his hand extended for a handshake, a gesture that violated Blackfoot customs regarding first meetings, Rebecca quietly intervened. "The chief will acknowledge you when he's ready," she murmured. To approach him directly without invitation shows disrespect. Sterling's jaw tightened at being corrected by someone he still considered a traitor, but he stepped back and waited for Tall Elk to initiate contact. The small gesture of cultural sensitivity helped establish a more respectful tone for what followed. The first day's negotiations focused on establishing ground rules and clarifying each side's primary concerns. The territorial representatives, led by Judge Harrison Webb, presented a list of demands that essentially required complete Blackfoot submission to white authority. They wanted guarantees that no tribe member would interfere with settlement expansion, mining operations, or railroad construction. In return, they offered a small reservation and promises of government supplies that everyone knew would be inadequate for survival. Tall Elk's response was measured but firm. His people would not accept confinement to lands that couldn't support them, nor would they abandon their traditional hunting grounds without fair compensation. However, he was willing to discuss shared use agreements, conflict resolution procedures, and protocols for peaceful coexistence. The gap between positions seemed insurmountable, and by evening, several white officials were suggesting that negotiations were pointless. Rebecca watched the fragile peace process teetering on the edge of collapse and knew she had to act. That night, as both delegations camped on opposite sides of the meadow, she approached Judge Webb with a proposal that had been forming in her mind throughout the day. What if we focused on preventing future conflicts rather than resolving past grievances? She suggested. Both sides want security for their families. Both sides need access to resources. Perhaps we can find ways to achieve those goals without one group having to surrender everything to the other. Webb studied her with interest. Unlike Colonel Sterling, the judge had been genuinely listening to the Blackfoot proposals and could see merit in some of their positions. What did you have in mind? He asked. Rebecca had spent the winter learning how the Blackfoot managed resources and resolved disputes. Their approaches were often more flexible and practical than the rigid legal frameworks favored by white authorities. Joint patrols to prevent cattle theft and protect travelers, she said. Shared hunting seasons that give both settlers and Blackfoot access to game. Trading posts where disputes can be resolved before they escalate to violence. Most importantly, a communication system so both sides know what the other is planning before misunderstandings turn deadly. The judge was intrigued despite himself. And who would oversee these arrangements? Who would both sides trust to mediate disputes fairly? Rebecca took a deep breath, knowing her next words would change her life forever. Someone who understands both cultures. Someone who has lived in both worlds and earned acceptance in each. Webb's eyebrows rose as he understood her implication. You're suggesting yourself as some kind of permanent liaison? I'm suggesting that peace requires people willing to stand between two communities and help them see each other clearly. Rebecca replied, I've already paid the price for crossing those boundaries. I might as well use what I've learned to prevent others from paying a higher price. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charging Bear, who approached their campfire. With the fluid grace that had first caught Rebecca's attention by the creek near Fort Benton, Judge Webb tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. But Rebecca's calm acceptance of the warrior's presence helped ease the tension. The elders would speak with walking through fire, Charging Bear said in careful English. They have questions about the White Council's true intentions. Rebecca glanced at Webb, who nodded his permission. As she rose to follow Charging Bear, the judge spoke quietly. Miss Thornton, consider carefully what you're proposing. A life spent mediating between two worlds that often hate each other. That's a heavy burden for anyone to carry. Heavier than watching those worlds destroy each other. Rebecca replied, I've spent my whole life feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. Maybe this is where I finally find my purpose. At the Blackfoot camp, the elders had gathered around singing Crane's Fire. The old medicine woman's eyes held a distant look as she spoke in rapid Blackfoot to the assembled leaders. Rebecca caught fragments about visions, about spirits choosing their instruments, about the necessity of sacrifice for the greater good. When the medicine woman finished speaking, Chief Tall Elk turned to Rebecca with grave attention, singing. Crane says the spirits showed her this moment many seasons ago, he said to the tribal interpreter. A scarred woman standing between two peoples, helping them see past their fears to the truth beneath. She says you were marked by fire not to be destroyed, but to be purified for this purpose. The weight of expectation in his words was almost overwhelming. Rebecca had sought only acceptance and belonging, but the elders were speaking of destiny. of spiritual calling, of a role that would define not just her own life but the future of two communities. "What would be required of me?" she asked quietly. "To speak truth to both sides, even when truth is unwelcome," Tall Elk replied. "To stand firm when pressure comes from those who profit from conflict. To remember that peace is not the absence of disagreement, but the presence of respect." Charging Bear stepped closer, his voice low but carrying clearly in the firelight. "And to know that some will never forgive you for choosing understanding over hatred." The warning was necessary. Rebecca understood that her proposed role would make her suspect to extremists on both sides. Too white for some Blackfoot, too Indian for some settlers. She would live permanently between worlds, never fully belonging to either. "I accept," she said simply. The next morning brought renewed negotiations, but with a different energy. Rebecca's proposal for a liaison position had been discussed by both delegations overnight, and while not everyone supported the idea, enough leaders saw its potential value to give it serious consideration. Colonel Sterling remained opposed, viewing any permanent arrangement with the Blackfoot as a dangerous precedent. But Judge Webb had been won over by the practical benefits of having someone who could prevent misunderstandings before they escalated to violence. The breakthrough came when a young cavalry officer arrived with urgent news. A band of Crow warriors had attacked a Blackfoot hunting party 2 days' ride north, killing 3 men and stealing horses. Traditional protocol would require the Blackfoot to seek vengeance, potentially triggering the broader war that everyone feared. But instead of calling for retaliation, Chief Tall Elk turned to Rebecca. "This is the test," he said quietly. "Can your new ways prevent the old cycle of blood for blood?" Rebecca felt every eye upon her as she considered the problem. The Crow and Blackfoot were traditional enemies, but their conflict could easily spread to involve white settlers if not handled carefully. "Give me 3 days," she said. "Let me try to arrange a meeting between Crow and Blackfoot representatives. If we can resolve this incident peacefully, it proves that dialogue works better than warfare." Judge Webb was skeptical. "And if you fail? If this incident triggers the very war we're trying to prevent, then we'll face that war knowing we tried." "Every alternative," Rebecca replied. "But if we don't try, we'll face it knowing we chose violence when peace was still possible." The decision to allow Rebecca's diplomatic mission marked the true beginning of her new life. As she prepared to ride out with a mixed party of white officials and Blackfoot warriors, she understood that she was crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. Standing beside her horse, preparing to mount, she felt Charging Bear's presence beside her. "You know this path will be lonely," he said quietly. "Always between worlds, never fully in either." Rebecca turned to meet his eyes, seeing love and concern mixed with deep understanding. "Not lonely," she said softly. "Not if you're willing to walk it with me." His smile was answer enough. As they rode out together toward an uncertain future, Rebecca carried with her the knowledge that she had finally found her place, not in any single world, but in the space between worlds where understanding could grow and bridges could be built across the deepest divides. The scarred girl who had once hidden from the world was now stepping forward to help heal its wounds, carrying within her the hard-won wisdom that true beauty lay not in perfection, but in the courage to stand between hatred and hope, always choosing the more difficult path of peace. The Crow-Blackfoot mediation took place at Eagle's Rest, a sacred site recognized by both tribes as neutral ground. Rebecca arrived with her mixed delegation to find tensions running dangerously high. The families of the murdered Blackfoot hunters demanded traditional justice, blood for blood, while the Crow warriors insisted they had acted in self-defense against cattle thieves. What should have been a straightforward mediation quickly revealed the complex web of grievances that had been building for generations. The stolen horses were only the latest incident in a cycle of raids and counter-raids that stretched back decades. Each side carried wounds that went far deeper than the immediate conflict. Rebecca spent the first day simply listening, allowing each group to present their version of events without interruption. The Blackfoot spoke of increasing pressure from white settlement that had pushed them into traditional crow hunting grounds. The Crow described their own desperation as buffalo herds dwindled and their people faced starvation. They speak of the same fear, Rebecca observed to Charging Bear during a break in the proceedings. Fear that their children will have no future, that their way of life is disappearing. But they see each other as the enemy instead of recognizing their common struggle. The breakthrough came when a Crow elder named Winter Hawk spoke about his grandson, killed the previous year in a raid that had been motivated by hunger rather than hatred. His words were translated between languages, but the emotion behind them needed no interpretation. "We take from each other because we have forgotten how to share," Winter Hawk said, his weathered face etched with grief. "Our ancestors knew ways of settling disputes that didn't require orphaning children. Perhaps it is time to remember those ways." Rebecca seized on his words, proposing a solution that drew from both tribal traditions. Instead of blood vengeance, the Crow would provide horses to replace those stolen, and both tribes would establish joint hunting expeditions that would ensure neither group went hungry during the difficult winter months ahead. The proposal was radical traditional enemies working together for survival, but desperation made both sides willing to consider alternatives to endless warfare. After 3 days of careful negotiation, with Rebecca serving as translator not just of languages but of concepts and customs, an agreement was reached. More importantly, the success of the mediation proved to skeptics on both sides that peaceful resolution was possible even in the most heated conflicts. Word of the achievement spread quickly through the territory, lending credibility to the broader peace negotiations between whites and Blackfoot. When Rebecca returned to the main conference, she found the atmosphere dramatically changed. Judge Webb had used her absence to build support for her liaison proposal among the territorial officials, while Chief Tall Elk had convinced reluctant Blackfoot leaders that cooperation offered better prospects than continued warfare. Colonel Sterling remained opposed, but his authority had been undermined by direct orders from Washington, emphasizing peaceful resolution. The military's role was being redefined from conquest to protection, a shift that required exactly the kind of cultural understanding Rebecca could provide. The formal peace treaty was signed on a crisp October morning, with representatives from both governments witnessing the historic agreement. The document established protocols for shared land use, conflict resolution procedures, and trading relationships that would benefit both communities. Most significantly, it created the position of cultural liaison, with Rebecca officially appointed to serve as mediator and interpreter between the two peoples. Her unique status, a white woman accepted by the Blackfoot as one of their own, gave her credibility with both sides that no traditional diplomat could match. But the signing ceremony also marked the beginning of Rebecca's most difficult challenges. As news of the treaty spread, reaction was swift and often hostile. Many settlers viewed any agreement with native tribes as betrayal, while some Blackfoot warriors saw cooperation with whites as surrender. Thomas Garrett led a group of Fort Benton merchants in denouncing the treaty, claiming it would give savages unacceptable influence over territorial development. "That scarred traitor has sold out her own people," he declared at a public meeting. "She's forgotten what race she belongs to." The personal attacks stung, but Rebecca had expected them. What proved more difficult was the isolation that came with her new role. She found herself trusted by leadership on both sides, but suspect to ordinary people who couldn't understand her divided loyalties. The test of her position came sooner than expected. In November, a group of young Blackfoot warriors, frustrated by the slow pace of change, raided a settler's cabin 30 miles south of Fort Benton. No one was killed, but livestock was stolen and property destroyed. The incident threatened to unravel everything the peace treaty had accomplished. Settlers demanded military retaliation, while tribal leaders insisted the warriors had acted without authorization and would be disciplined according to Blackfoot law. Rebecca found herself caught between two valid but incompatible concepts of justice. The settlers wanted the raiders arrested and tried in territorial courts, while the Blackfoot maintained that their own judicial processes were sufficient. "This is exactly why the treaty was a mistake," Colonel Sterling told her during an emergency meeting. "Savages don't understand civilized law. They only respect force. And this is exactly why white authorities cannot be trusted," Standing Wolf said when she met with the Blackfoot Council. "They demand submission disguised as cooperation." For 3 weeks, Rebecca worked tirelessly to find a solution that would satisfy both sides. She proposed a joint tribunal, tribal elders working with territorial officials to determine appropriate punishment that would respect both legal systems. The process was complex and sometimes frustrating, requiring endless patience as each side struggled to understand the other's perspective. But gradually, a consensus emerged. The raiders would make full restitution to the damaged settler, provide labor to repair what they had destroyed, and face temporary banishment from tribal activities. More importantly, the incident led to the establishment of joint patrols, mixed groups of soldiers and Blackfoot warriors, who would work together to prevent future conflicts and ensure swift response when problems arose. The success of this crisis resolution validated Rebecca's role, but it also highlighted the personal cost of her position. She was spending most of her time traveling between communities, mediating disputes, and translating not just languages but entire worldviews. Her relationship with Charging Bear became one of the few constants in her increasingly complicated life. He had chosen to join her mission, serving as her guide and protector as she moved between worlds. Their partnership was both professional and deeply personal, built on shared commitment to peace and growing love that transcends cultural boundaries. But even their relationship faced unique challenges. Traditional Blackfoot marriage customs required extended family approval and elaborate ceremonies, while territorial law didn't recognize unions between whites and natives. They found themselves creating their own traditions, blending elements from both cultures in ways that reflected their unique circumstances. The winter of 1848 brought relative peace to the territory, but Rebecca understood that her work was far from complete. Each success in conflict resolution revealed new areas where understanding was needed. Disputes over water rights, trading privileges, and land use required constant attention and careful mediation. She established a permanent office at a trading post halfway between Fort Benton and the main Blackfoot camp, creating a neutral space where representatives from both communities could meet regularly. The building became a symbol of cooperation, white and native workers laboring side by side to construct something that served everyone's interests. As spring approached, Rebecca received word that territorial officials in Washington wanted a full report on the peace initiative's success. The request filled her with both pride and apprehension. The treaty had largely achieved its goals, violence had decreased dramatically, trade was flourishing, and both communities were adapting to coexistence. But she also knew that her position remained precarious. Political changes in Washington could easily lead to new policies that emphasized military solutions over diplomatic ones. The peace she had helped build was still fragile, dependent on the continued goodwill of leaders who might not remain in power. "Do you ever regret the choice you made?" Charging Bear asked one evening as they sat by the fire in their modest cabin near the trading post. Rebecca considered the question seriously. Her life had become more complicated and demanding than she could have imagined when she first fled Fort Benton. She faced constant criticism from people who questioned her loyalty, endured the loneliness of existing between worlds, and carried the enormous responsibility of maintaining peace between communities that had been enemies for generations. "I regret the pain it's caused others," she said finally. My mother still doesn't understand why I left. Some of your people still see me as an outsider. I'll never be fully accepted by either world. But do you regret the choice itself? Rebecca looked across the valley where the lights of both white and Blackfoot settlements twinkled in the darkness. Children from both communities played together at the trading post now, learning each other's languages and customs. Families that had once lived in fear of attack were building homes and planning futures. No, she said quietly. This is who I was meant to be, not despite my scars, but because of them. The fire that marked me also taught me how to survive, how to find strength in the broken places. If that experience can help others avoid the kind of pain that comes from hatred and fear, then it was worth every moment of suffering. As winter gave way to spring, Rebecca prepared for the next phase of her mission. The territorial report would determine whether the peace initiative received continued support or was abandoned in favor of more aggressive policies. Everything she had worked for hung in the balance, dependent on politicians who had never lived on the frontier or experienced the daily realities of cultural conflict, but she faced the uncertainty with hard-won confidence. The scarred girl who had once hidden from the world had become a woman who stood openly between opposing forces, offering her own story as proof that understanding could triumph over hatred, that bridges could be built across even the deepest divides, whatever challenges lay ahead. She would meet them with the strength that came from knowing her place in the world, not as a victim of circumstances, but as an agent of healing in a broken land that desperately needed people willing to choose hope over fear. 5 years after the signing of the peace treaty, Rebecca stood on the porch of the expanded trading post that had become the unofficial capital of a new kind of frontier community. The settlement that had grown around her mediation center bore little resemblance to the fear-driven outposts that had once dotted the territory. White and Blackfoot families lived side by side, their children attending a school where lessons were taught in both English and Blackfoot, their economies intertwined through trade relationships that benefited everyone. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't come without cost. 3 separate attempts by extremist groups to sabotage the peace had required Rebecca's intervention, each crisis testing her diplomatic skills and personal resolve. She had survived assassination attempts from both sides, weathered political investigations that questioned her loyalty, and endured personal attacks that targeted not just her policies, but her scarred appearance and unconventional marriage. But she had also witnessed miracles that validated every sacrifice. The children playing in the dusty street spoke multiple languages without thinking about it. Former enemies worked together to build irrigation systems that helped both communities survive drought years. Young warriors who might once have earned prestige through raids now competed in joint, athletic contests that channeled competitive instincts into peaceful pursuits. The letter N, Rebecca's hand, represented the culmination of years of careful documentation and advocacy. Washington had finally approved the Montana Territory Peaceful Coexistence Act, legislation that would establish her mediation model as official policy throughout the Western Territories. The scarred outcast who had once been considered damaged goods was now being asked to train a new generation of cultural liaisons. Impressive reading? Charging Bear asked, approaching with their 3-year-old daughter balanced on his shoulders. Little Sarah Running Fox had inherited her mother's brown hair and her father's dark eyes, but more importantly, she had been born into a world where her mixed heritage was seen as a bridge rather than a burden. Life-changing reading, Rebecca replied, holding up the official documents. They want us in Washington to address Congress about expanding the program. Apparently, our little experiment has caught the attention of people who matter. Charging Bear lowered their daughter to the ground, where she immediately ran toward a group of children engaged in a complex game that seemed to involve equal parts hide-and-seek and traditional Blackfoot hunting education. The sight of her daughter moving effortlessly between worlds filled Rebecca with profound satisfaction. "Are you ready for that kind of attention?" Charging Bear asked. Washington politicians are different from frontier settlers and tribal councils. Rebecca traced the familiar scars on her cheek, a gesture that had evolved from shame to contemplation over the years. "I've learned that the same principles apply everywhere. People fear what they don't understand, but most are capable of growth if someone is willing to be patient with them." The afternoon brought a stream of visitors seeking Rebecca's mediation services. A land dispute between a white rancher and a Blackfoot hunting party required careful negotiation about seasonal grazing rights. A mixed marriage facing opposition. From both families needed guidance on navigating cultural expectations. A trading disagreement over the value of buffalo hides versus manufactured goods required someone who understood both economic systems. Each case was different, but Rebecca had developed a methodology that proved remarkably effective. She always began by helping each side articulate their core concerns beneath the surface positions. She looked for shared values that could serve as common ground. Most importantly, she insisted that all parties see each other as human beings with legitimate needs, rather than obstacles to be overcome. The secret, she had learned, was not to eliminate differences, but to help people see those differences as strengths rather than threats. The Blackfoot understanding of land as a living entity to be respected could coexist with white concepts of ownership and development. Traditional tribal methods of conflict resolution could complement formal legal systems. Different approaches to family spirituality and community could enrich rather than threaten each other. As evening approached, Rebecca made her way to the small cemetery at the edge of the settlement. The graves there told the story of the territory's transformation, white and Blackfoot markers side by side. Shared losses that had helped forge shared communities. She stopped at her mother's grave, marked with a simple stone that read, "Sarah Thornton, beloved mother and teacher." Sarah had lived long enough to see her daughter's work vindicated, to understand that Rebecca's choice to leave Fort Benton had led not to abandonment, but to a larger form of service. The reconciliation between mother and daughter had been one of Rebecca's greatest personal victories. "She would be proud," said a familiar voice behind her. Rebecca turned to find Singing Crane approaching, moving more slowly now, but still carrying herself with quiet dignity. The old medicine woman had become Rebecca's closest advisor and friend, offering spiritual guidance that complemented practical diplomacy. "Some days I wonder if I've done enough," Rebecca admitted. "There's still so much hatred in the world, so many people who choose fear over understanding." Singing Crane studied the mixed community spread out below them, lights beginning to twinkle in windows where families of every background were gathering for evening meals. "The spirits do not ask us to heal all wounds," she said in her careful English. "They ask us to tend the wounds within our reach. You have given this place something it never had before, hope that different peoples can live together in peace. But what happens when we're gone? When the next generation faces new challenges, new fears?" The old woman smiled, gesturing toward the children still playing in the fading light. "Look at them. They do not see barriers where we saw walls. They do not carry the old hatreds because they were never taught to hate. This is your true legacy, not the treaties you've negotiated or the conflicts you've resolved, but the children who will grow up believing that cooperation is normal." That night, as Rebecca worked on her presentation for Congress, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened girl who had hidden her scars and accepted society's judgment about her worth seemed like a different person entirely. Yet the connection was undeniable. Every experience of rejection had taught her empathy for the marginalized. Every moment of pain had prepared her to understand others' suffering. The scars themselves had become her greatest asset. In a world where people often hid their wounds behind masks of aggression or indifference, her visible marks of survival made her approachable to anyone carrying invisible pain. Soldiers haunted by battlefield memories, native warriors struggling with the loss of traditional ways, Women trapped in marriages that offered no respect, all found in Rebecca someone who understood what it meant to be damaged and yet whole. Her presentation to Congress would emphasize this principle, that effective diplomacy required people who had experienced genuine struggle and emerged with compassion intact. The polished politicians and career diplomats who typically handled frontier negotiations had never lived with real vulnerability, never learned the humility that came from having to rebuild one's sense of worth from nothing. The morning brought unexpected visitors, a delegation from the Cherokee Nation in the Southeastern Territories, seeking guidance on negotiating with federal officials who wanted to relocate their people to Western reservations. Word of Rebecca's success had spread throughout Native communities, creating demands for her expertise that far exceeded what one person could provide. "We have heard that you know how to make white leaders listen to reason," said the Cherokee Chief, Joseph Ridge. "Our people face removal from lands our ancestors are buried in. Perhaps you can teach us the magic words that convince them to honor their promises." Rebecca felt the weight of expectations that had become familiar, but never comfortable. People hoped she possessed some special formula for bridging cultural divides, some secret knowledge that could solve any conflict. The reality was much simpler and more difficult. Successful mediation required patience, empathy, and the willingness to see humanity in people who seemed determined to behave inhumanly. "There are no magic words," she told the Cherokee delegation honestly. "There's only the hard work of helping people see past their fears to recognize shared interests. But I can teach you the methods I've learned, and more importantly, I can help you train your own mediators who understand both Cherokee and white ways of thinking." The conversation continued for hours, with Rebecca outlining practical strategies while acknowledging the enormous challenges the Cherokee faced. Federal Indian policy was becoming increasingly aggressive, driven by land-hungry settlers and politicians who saw Native peoples as obstacles to national destiny. But even in discussing such dire circumstances, Rebecca found reasons for hope. The Cherokee delegation included young people who had been educated in white schools, but retained strong connections to their tribal heritage. They represented exactly the kind of cultural bridge builders who could make a difference if given the opportunity and training. As the delegation prepared to leave, Chief Ridge presented Rebecca with a ceremonial necklace that had belonged to his grandmother. "She was a healer," he explained. "She taught me that some people are marked by the spirits to carry pain for others, to transform suffering into wisdom that can benefit entire communities. I see those marks on you, and I know she would want you to have this." Rebecca accepted the gift with profound gratitude, understanding that she was being recognized not despite her scars, but because of what they represented: survival, transformation, and the hard-won ability to help others navigate their own dark passages. That evening, as she packed for the journey to Washington, Rebecca took one last walk through the settlement that had become her life's work. The mixed community wasn't perfect. Prejudices still existed, conflict still arose, and some people remained committed to old hatreds. But it was proof that change was possible, that people could learn to see past surface differences to recognize common humanity. Standing at the same creek where she had first encountered Charging Bear 8 years earlier, Rebecca remembered the frightened girl who had believed herself unworthy of love or acceptance. That girl could never have imagined a life that awaited, dangerous but meaningful, difficult but deeply fulfilling. The scars on her face had faded but never disappeared. And Rebecca was glad. They served as constant reminders that beauty and worth were not about perfection, but about resilience. Not about avoiding damage, but about transforming it into strength that could benefit others. As she prepared to carry her message to the nation's capital, Rebecca understood that her greatest achievement was not the peace she had helped create, but the proof she offered that anyone, regardless of how the world had marked them, could choose to become an agent of healing rather than an embodiment of hurt. The girl who had been seen as damaged goods had Become a woman who helped others discover their own hidden worth. And in a world that desperately needed people willing to build bridges across its many divides, that transformation offered hope that even the deepest scars could become sources of unexpected beauty. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.